Bava Batra, Daf Yomi Bava Batra. The doorman's limitations, lemimrא debeit shar מעליותא. You know that many of the better apartments in New York City have got doormen. And the doorman's role is very important. But we'll understand that there's certain things that a doorman cannot do. The shir is dedicated by Ilan Levi, Le'inui Nishmat Aviv, his father, Alec Levi, Eliyahu ben Yeshayahu, whose yortzeit it is today on the 25th day of Sivan. Ilan is not only a regular participant in the Matmonim, but somebody enormously instrumental in our functioning as an organization that manages to do the things we're doing and getting the shirim out to everybody on the various different platforms. If we were a large organization, Ilan would be known as our CFO. He certainly fills that and many other roles in support of us. We thank you, Ilan. And what an appropriate shir to memorialize your father, who was a person who cared so much about others, noticed others, empathized with others, and influenced people to be the best version of themselves. As you see, once we get into the shir, it will be very relevant to who your father was. The Mishnah says on Daf Yomi Bava Batra that Koifin oto livnot beit shar v'delet lechatzer. You can force members of an apartment. You've got an apartment block, or you've got a courtyard with people living around it. Every one of the residents has to participate in building a beit shar and a door. What is a beit shar? Says Rashi, beit shar is lihiyot shomer hapetach yoshev sham betzel, so that the doorman has a place to sit when it's hot. He can sit in the Beit Shar. And he stops the public from peeping into the yard, from walking into the yard. He looks after the place. That's what a Beit Shar is. Says the Gemara, lemimrא debeit shar מעליותא. It would seem to be implying here that by building a Beit Shar, building a little hut for the doorman to stay in, that's an improvement of the property, and that's why you can force everybody to participate. But that isn't so. It's not an improvement of the property. Notice how I translated that lemimrא debeit shar מעליותא, that this is an advantage for the property, because we'll come back to that. How can that be? There was the case of this chassid, this pious person, who used to have Eliyahu, often talking to him. Eliyahu would come and engage in conversation with him. Avad beit shar v'tu lo mishtay b'hadei. He put a doorman and a post for the doorman to stay in front of his home, and Eliyahu never visited him again. That was the end of it. So you've got to be careful with these doormen and their homes. It's not always good. Says Rashi, why? Because the doorman doesn't allow the poor people in. And if the poor people can't shout in a way that the people inside can hear, that's a problem. Eliyahu wasn't happy with that. Notice Rashi, unlike other Rishonim, the Rimigash and others, doesn't say, and therefore the Oni doesn't get tzedakah. Rashi doesn't mention anything about the loss of tzedakah. Rashi talks about ein kolam nishma. Says the Gemara, don't worry, there's a way to do it. There's a way to build this hut in a way that doesn't interrupt the sound of the poor man's voice. You build it outside, not inside, with a door, without a door, with a lock, without a lock. The Gemara goes into various different ways that it can be done. And in such a case, once again, he says, if you build it outside, then it stops the sound of the poor person penetrating into the yard. But you can build it on the inner part in such a way that the poor person can get partially into the area of the yard, and his voice will still be heard. That's the Gemara. There are three questions that I want to deal with in the short time that we have together, and we'll try and work through them all. The first one is, we've just learned that Bava Batra is not about Isurim, it's not about Ben Odom L'Mokom. We've just said Bava Batra is about agreements and understandings and custom. And right already on Daf Zion, we're starting with, and what about the poor person, and are you allowed to do this, and Eliyahu Hanovi? What's that got to do with Bava Batra? Secondly, the Rambam paskins this in Hilchos Shchenim. He brings us להלכה, חצר השותפים, כל אחד מהם כופה את חברו לעשות בה את שער ודלת, וכן כל הדברים שאחרת צריכה להם צורך גדול. That's the Rambam brings us in Hilchos Shchenim. Why is this in Hilchos Shchenim? Why is it not in Hilchos Matnos Aniyim? This is about how you treat a poor person. This is not about how you build a construction. It's not about neighbors. The din that we're talking about here is how to relate to the ani. See, we just didn't have a doorman here, so the ani walked right in. He's supposed to stand outside and shout, and then we can decide how to respond. So that's the second point. That why does the Rambam bring this in Cheshire? And more than that, the Rambam doesn't bring all these different ways to do it in a kosher way. The Rif also doesn't mention this. This whole piece of Gemara, where the Gemara says, there's a way if you build it outside, not inside, with a key, without a key, with a door, without a... There are ways to do it so that the poor person can still be heard. The Rambam doesn't mention that at all, nor does the Rif. And the third thing is, why is there such a problem with a shomer? What happens with a shomer? You've got a doorman in one of these buildings in New York, and a poor person comes and says, I want to see Reb Sender in apartment 408. The doorman rings up to apartment 408. He says, there's somebody here who wants to see you. And you say, ask him his name, check it out, and then you let him in. Or you say, is he collecting money? Sure, I'll come down and give him some money. Why can't the doorman transmit the information? If there's a doorman, I understand according to the Nimukei Yosef, the Nimukei Yosef defines a Beit Shar differently. The Nimukei Yosef says a Beit Shar is hu binyan shosim lifnei hapetach shelo yiru avrim et bnei hachatzer. It's a building you put in front of the doorway, in front of the gateway, so that the passers-by can't look into the yard. So according to the Nimukei Yosef, there's no human being there, it's just a structure. So I understand now you stop the poor person from coming in, the person can't call from outside. How does the person inside even know that there's a poor person there? They didn't have bells in those days. How would that even work? But according to Rashi, who says it's a place where the doorman sits, let the doorman call the Balabayit. Why is it such a terrible thing that if there's a Beit Shar, that's a problem for the ani? And those are the three questions that we have to deal with. So firstly, there's a beautiful Nachlas David. The Nachlas David was one of the important talmidim of Reb Chaim Volozhin. So this 19th century was the Rov in Minsk, and his Sefer, Nachlas David, is on the Masechtas that we have. It is very, very important. And the Nachlas David says, the issue here is not about how you build the gate. I mean, it's the issue in the Gemara, but it's not the halachic issue and it's not the Mishnah. How you build the gate is you have to build it in such a way that doesn't interrupt the poor person. That you build one you can force, because there is a way to do it that's kosher. So if one of the residents says, we've got Reb Sender's already, we've established is living in this building, and he says, I'm not paying for the Beit Shar because it's going to interrupt the poor people. I want poor people to come in. And I'm not happy. I know what happened. There was a chassid when he built a Beit Shar. Eliyahu Novi stopped talking to him, says Reb Sender. I don't want Eliyahu Novi to stop talking to me. Reb Sender, how often does Eliyahu Novi talk to you? You don't know. Maybe he does. So he says, I don't want that to stop. Says the Nachlas David, we can say to him, so we'll find a kosher way to build it. We'll build it in such a way that the ani can get to you. This is not about how we'll build it. This is not about design. This is about cost, about budget. And since there's a kosher way to do it, we can force you to pay. And then the Vaad Habayit will decide how we actually build it. There's certain criteria. And so it explains the Nachlas David. Here all we're talking about is the kfiyah, the ability of one neighbor to force another neighbor to participate in payment. And that answers why this isn't Bava Batra. Because that's what the piece that we're dealing with here is just whether or not you can force payment. And since there is a way to build it that will allow the aniyim access, therefore you're allowed to enforce the building of a Beit Shar. It doesn't have to, it's something that nobody can get their way out of. So the Nachlas David is important. If you have an opportunity, it's worthwhile learning through it. But Moshe Feinstein has a beautiful note in Dibros Moshe. Moshe Feinstein is known for his Shailas and Tshuvas. He was the Posek Hador. But even more magnificent than his Shailas and Tshuvas is his works on Shas. The Dibros Moshe, where he writes magnificent, very, very voluminous works on the Gemara. And he questions here, what's even the Havamim of the Gemara? Why is the Gemara suggesting, is worried about whether you can force him or you can't force him? What about Eliyahu Hanovi? Says Moshe Feinstein, we're dealing with a Midas Chasidus. We're talking about a very high level of human being. For an ordinary person, this isn't even an issue. Why are we even getting there? Explains Moshe very beautifully. What the Gemara is dealing with here is Chazal would never create a takana, they would never legislate a law which contravenes even the highest standard of menschlichkeit. Even though not everybody is expected to be on that level, this is a midas chasidus, certain very, very pious people, but to say that there's a takana that you can force people, as the Mishnah says, kofin oto livnot beit shar, that's a takana of Chazal. The Chazal, the rabbis have instituted this law that everybody should participate in the hut for the doorman. They wouldn't require that. if it inhibited the poor people in such a way that Eliyahu Hanavi might stop coming. And even though there's nobody in the building who Eliyahu Hanavi has ever come to visit, there wouldn't be such a tachon. It's just an interesting idea. The Chazal would not be mistaken something that in order to fulfill it, you might have to contravene even the very, very highest levels of what it is to be a mensch, what it is to be a tzaddik, to be a righteous person. So understanding the Gemara a little bit better, so we understand why it's in the Shchenim, we understand why it's in Bava Batra, but the issue still remains then, what about the doorman? Why can the doorman not communicate the fact that there's somebody at the door who wants to see the balabais for a donation? Why are we so worried about this interruption? Furthermore, although Reb Moshe Feinstein, and it seems the Nachlas David also, take it for granted that this is a midas chasidus, that this is a high level, it's not a halachic requirement, it's a very, very high level. The Yad Ramah, the Ramah was one of the important Rishonim at the time of the Ramban, he was also in Spain, and the Yad Ramah and the Meiri both say specifically that it's asir, this is osur, ve'en tzorich lo maden kofen osur. Certainly you can't force him because it's prohibited. There's actually an isur to build a Beit Shar in a way that the aniyim can't shout from the door and get the attention of the balabait. It's an isur. Unlike, so the way we've learned so far, and the way that Moshe Feinstein has learned, and Nachlas David and certain Rishonim, it seems to be that this is just a midas chasidus. This is a high level of piety, and that's the simple understanding of the Gemara. But the Yad Ramah and the Meiri both mention the word isur, that this is something that is also, there's an isur here. And one has to question, what is the isur? Or what kind of isur? Where does the isur come from? Where does this prohibition come from? Who mentions the prohibition? What is it? There's a beautiful Ben Yehoyada, the Ben Ish Chai, who says it comes from the posuk, or he said one can attach it to the posuk in Mishlei of Al Tigzal Dal Ki Dalhu Va'al Tedakei Ani B'Shar. Don't oppress a poor person at the gate. That's the literal translation of the posuk. All the Mefarshim learn, don't oppress the poor person. B'Shar in the Beis Din. Shar is another word for a court of law. So in a court of law, don't oppress a poor person. Says the Ben Yehodaya that based on this piece of Gemara, the pshat might be, don't oppress him at the gateway. Don't oppress him at the doorman's hut. In a way that you build a hut in the gateway that will inhibit his voice from carrying into the yard. And then he goes on to say, "V'nireli de ne'anash midah keneged midah hu asa beit shar v'al yedei kach lo haya nishma kol ha'ani." And the punishment is midah keneged midah. He built this barrier to the ani's voice, and he can no longer hear the voice of the ani. Gam hu lo yishma kol Eliyahu. So he won't hear Eliyahu. Saying that it's not that Eliyahu never comes to visit you. He comes every day. It's difficult to hear him. We don't hear him. And to build the capacity to hear Eliyahu, you do that by building the capacity to listen to the heart of a poor person. And herein lies the answer to our question about the gate man, the doorman. The doorman can communicate information, but the doorman can't communicate to you the anguish in the heart of the poor person that you hear when he stands at the doorway and he cries out for help. That's what we want the ani to hear. And that's why Rashi doesn't say it's about whether or not the ani gets his money. Rashi says, "Ve'ein kolam nishma, ve'habeit shar shebifnim mafsik hakol letocho." This is about the voice, the sound. The problem here is sound. The problem here is not information. It's easy to have a system whereby the person inside will have the information. He could leave money outside. He could leave a bag of dollar bills and tell the doorman whenever a poor person comes, give him a few dollars. There are things, you can get around this. And that's not what the Gemara is concerned about. The Gemara is concerned about you've sterilized your environment from the sound of the anguish of poor people. And that's not how you build community. Moshe Cordovera says in the Torah Dvorah, one of the ways to use your eyes is not just not to look at things you shouldn't be looking. He says it's to look at things you should be looking at. For example, look into the eyes of a poor person and identify, see him, let him be seen by you, and pray for him. Give him a bracha, daven for him. This is not just about money, this is not just about a transaction. If you hear the oni crying at the door, you'll daven. If you don't hear him, you'll give him $1. It's not just about the dollar. The dollar will help him with a dollar. How much can you buy with a dollar? But your tefillah could change his life. But if you don't even hear his cry, you're not going to daven for him. You're not going to have tefillah. That's the call that Rashi is talking about. That's the call that the Ben Yehoyada is talking about. That's the call that this whole sugya is talking about, this whole piece of Gemara. There's a beautiful piece I discovered also I didn't even know that he had a sefer, Reb Gershon Edelstein, who died not long ago, called Mimeged Gerish Yerachim. Gershon Edelstein was one of the Gedolei Yisrael who led the Torah world together with Reb Chaim Kanievsky, and they were a wonderful pair because Reb Chaim Kanievsky was Kula Torah. He didn't know what was happening outside of his Daled Amos, but he knew the Torah, he knew Hashem's will, he knew what Hashem wanted of us. And Reb Gershon was a human person who knew the world, who understood people, and they worked together very, very well. It was a tragedy when they both passed away not that long after each other. And he has a beautiful piece here where he brings the case from Gemara Makos, where there was a man that Eliyahu used to come and visit until once a lion killed a person nearby him. And the Gemara says, but it wasn't his fault. Why did Eliyahu stop visiting? The Gemara says, because he should have davened. The fact that the lion ate this person in front of his eyes means he didn't daven. And Rabbi Gershon links it to the fact that a Kohen Gadol is punished for a murder that happens by mistake. And that's why the person who committed the murder goes to the Arei Miklat as long as the Kohen Gadol is still alive. And once the Kohen Gadol dies, he can come out of the Arei Miklat, so he's going to daven that the person dies. Because the Kohen Gadol should have davened, that such murders won't take place on his watch. And Rabbi Gershon brings a marsha from Kiddushin, and he says, and this is unbelievable, you should listen to this, you should read this, you should review it. I've got the full piece online. You can look at the full. I've only given you one page of the sources, but all the sources are online. We need to know this in our times now. Davening works not miraculously. Eloteva. It's completely natural. But when you daven, there's a response. That doesn't mean the response is always in your favor, but that tefillah arouses a response, that will happen no matter what. I went to visit to the Shiva house of the young man from Ra'anana who died, and his mother, who looks like a completely Chiloni woman, and I was speaking to her, and she said she was raised Chiloni, and in the army her heart became frum. She said, I still dress Chiloni, but my heart became frum. And all she asks from everybody who comes, she said, don't be sad, don't be miserable, we're fighting an important war, my son's in a wonderful place, nothing to be sad about. What you do have to do is tefillah. Go home and daven. All this chiloni and slacks and short sleeves is telling the people there, go home and daven. It says the Maharshal, because davening works, prayer works not only as a miracle, prayer works absolutely naturally. And if something happens that you could have avoided with prayer, you're held partially responsible for that. Says Eliyahu Hanavi, if you are not davening for this poor person because you can't hear his cry, I can't engage with you, I can't interact with you. And so we have to understand the difference between gaining information. We can gain information all sorts of different ways, including digitally. It's only information. Even if you're looking at YouTube, it's only pixels, it's only information. When you're face to face with a human being and you're transferring energy from one to the other, you can see, you can hear, you can feel in your heart, and you can respond with encouragement, with chizuk, with bracha, and most important of all, with tefillah, with prayer.